When astronomers point their telescopes at distant stars, they are looking into the past. The light that reaches them came from those stars thousands of years ago, and what they see is not what exists now, but what existed when that light was being emitted. Something analogous occurs with Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science. The revelations he made in the first decades of the 20th century about certain evolutionary configurations of humanity reach us now like that light from the stars, emitted from a point that was left behind in time, but which illuminate with disconcerting precision realities that only became visible long after they were announced. Among Steiner's revelations that have this quality of anticipatory light, few are as specific and as startlingly precise as what he said about the souls who would incarnate in the period after World War II, the souls who arrived in the world between 1945 and 1965. Steiner did not use these exact dates because he was describing configurations of cosmic forces, not calendar periods. But what he described corresponds with a correspondence that careful study reveals precisely to the characteristics of those souls who arrived in the world in that period of extraordinary transition. What if everything you've experienced so far wasn't by chance? Perhaps there is a silent purpose being revealed little by little. And when you understand these signs, everything starts to make sense in a way that is almost impossible to ignore. A chance for the content that is in the first link pinned in the comments or in the description. What made that period extraordinary was not what historians record. Post-war reconstruction, the demographic baby boom, the beginning of the Cold War, television reaching homes. What made that period extraordinary, from the perspective of spiritual science, was a configuration of spiritual forces that rarely combine in the way they did between 1945 and the early years of the 60s. Steiner had described in conferences held between 1917 and 1924 his understanding of how the different hierarchical beings, the angels, the archangels, the archetypes, the even higher beings, that the Christian tradition calls dominations, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, angels, work together to ensure that the right souls incarnate at the right times so that the development of human consciousness can advance. This work of the hierarchies is neither capricious nor arbitrary. It obeys spiritual laws as precise as the physical laws that govern the movements of the planets, and the souls that incarnate in certain historical periods arrive at those periods because there is a correspondence between what that period demands and what those souls, due to the evolutionary history of their previous incarnations, are in a position to offer. The period between 1945 and 1965 required a specific type of soul, and the cosmos responded to this demand by calling to incarnate in that period souls who had been prepared over multiple incarnations to respond to a specific set of challenges. Understanding what these challenges are and how this preparation manifests itself in the concrete lives of these souls is what allows us to understand what Steiner would call the last spiritual mission of this generation. The first element that Steiner would identify as central to understanding this generation is its relationship with what he called the inversion point, the moment when a force that had been growing in one direction reaches its maximum and begins to transform in its opposite direction. All of human history in Steiner's view can be understood as a series of inversion points, moments in which the cosmos turns a page and humanity is called to begin a new chapter, with capabilities that the previous chapter developed, but that only in the new chapter will they be able to find their most fruitful application. The period between 1939 and 1945 was, for Steiner, one of those inversion points of maximum intensity. The moment when materialism, which had progressively dominated Western civilization since the 17th century, reached its paroxysm of destruction with nuclear bombs and extermination camps, and when the cosmos began to create the conditions for the turn toward the spirit. Souls that incarnate immediately after a turning point have a mission that is, by nature, different from souls that incarnate in the phases of linear development that precede the point. They are not enough to continue what was being done. They are enough to start something new. They arrive carrying in their karma the experiences of the incarnations that went through the previous phases, but they also arrive with an openness to what did not yet exist, with the ability to perceive possibilities that only became visible after the turning point. And they arrive, fundamentally, with the mission of being the first generation of the new chapter O, which is simultaneously a privilege and a responsibility of considerable weight. What is the new chapter that this generation has been called to inaugurate? Steiner would be very specific here. It is not the chapter of returning to the spiritual forms that existed before materialism. That path is closed, and trying to follow it is one of the most common forms of spiritual regression. It is not the chapter of New Age spirituality that mixes elements from different traditions without the rigor that any of them requires. It is the chapter of what Steiner called the spirituality of free consciousness, a form of relationship with the spiritual world that is at once as rigorous as natural science, as based on verifiable experience as any laboratory requires. and as capable of finding the warmth of spiritual love as the best religious traditions have produced. A spirituality that does not need to choose between intelligence and devotion, between critical thinking and openness to mystery, between the developed individual self and participation in the spiritual cosmos. This is the spirituality that the generation born between 1945 and 1965 was called upon to develop and transmit. And the specific karma that prepared her for this summoning includes incarnations in which she developed both the intellectual capacities and the spiritual capacities that this synthesis requires. Incarnations in which she studied, in which she sought, in which she erred and corrected herself, in which she learned what works and what does not work in spiritual development, in which she developed a sensitivity to the difference between genuine spirituality and spirituality that uses the symbols, and language of the spiritual to serve purposes that are, at its core, self-centered. This capacity for discernment, the ability to perceive the difference between what is genuinely spiritual and what merely appears spiritual, is one of the most specific and necessary contributions that the generation of 1945-1965 has to offer the contemporary world. In a period when spirituality has become popular in ways that often trivialize it, when any practice that produces altered states of consciousness is called spiritual, when the market has created an industry of spiritual products and services that often serves narcissism rather than genuine development, in this period, the ability to discern the authentic from the superficial has a value that cannot be overstated. How did this capacity for discernment develop in the generation in question? Precisely through the decades of search that most of its members have gone through. Those born between 1945 and 1965 reached adulthood at a time when Western religious traditions were in crisis, when institutional Christianity had lost the ability to answer the questions that modern consciousness posed, and when the available alternatives ranged from Eastern traditions newly arrived in the West to countercultural practices that mixed spirituality with psychoactive substances, in a search for intense experiences that often confuse the authenticity of the experience with the depth of development. Most members of this generation have experimented to varying degrees with some of these alternatives and learned through experience to distinguish what was genuine about them and what was mistaken. This experiential learning, this path of trial and error, of excitement and disappointment, of discovery and abandonment and new discovery, was not a diversion from the mission. It was the very process through which the capacity for discernment was developed. The member of this generation who went through an intense spiritual crisis, who embraced a tradition enthusiastically and then questioned it critically, who went without any spiritual reference for a period and learned to find his way from within rather than always relying on external guides, that human being has developed a kind of spiritual autonomy that generations raised in stable traditions rarely develop. And this autonomy, this ability to be spiritually responsible for oneself, to ascertain through experience what is real and what is illusion, to trust one's own organs of spiritual perception, rather than being permanently dependent on the authority of others, is precisely what the development of the consciousness of the conscious soul demands. The second specific dimension of this generation's mission, which Steiner would point out as central, is its role in relation to what he called the crisis of imagination. The modern human being, saturated with images produced by others through television, cinema, and now the internet and social media, is progressively losing the ability to produce his own inner images, to have an imaginative life that is genuinely his own, instead of being the echo of the images that the cultural industry continually pours into consciousness. This loss of creative imagination is not just an aesthetic issue. It is a profound spiritual issue, because the imagination is, in Steiner's view, the organ of perception of the spiritual world closest to ordinary consciousness. A humanity without a living imagination is a humanity without access to the spiritual through this specific route. Those born between 1945 and 1965 grew up before television completely saturated the field of imagination, or at least before the time when audiovisual saturation began to reach the levels that subsequent generations have known since birth. They had, to a greater or lesser extent, a childhood and adolescence in which the imagination had room to develop, in which boredom, instead of being immediately filled with external stimuli, was experienced as a space in which inner creativity was forced to find its own expression. This difference in the formation of the imagination is not trivial. It corresponds to a real difference in the structure of the organs of inner perception that Steiner saw as the instruments of spiritual development. The mission of this generation in relation to the crisis of imagination is twofold. On the one hand, to preserve and cultivate in their own lives the imaginative capacity that was developed in those years of less saturated formation. On the other hand, transmitting to younger generations, who grew up in an environment of unprecedented image saturation, not the specific images that were formed, but the ability to form images, the practice of creating rather than just consuming, the experience. that there is an inner imaginative life that is incomparably richer than any externally produced audiovisual content can be. This transmission does not occur through speeches about the importance of imagination. It happens through example, through being the grandparent who tells stories instead of turning on the television, being the parent who reads aloud instead of showing videos on the tablet, being the friend or mentor who invites young people to imagine instead of just consume. It occurs through any form of creation that life has made possible, the gardening that is both work and living meditation, the cooking that transforms simple ingredients into experiences, the crafts that use the hands to create what did not exist before, the music that emerges from within rather than just being reproduced from without. The third specific dimension of this generation's mission is the one that has to do directly with what Steiner called the question of thresholds. The threshold of death is the most obvious, but it is not the only one. Steiner identified multiple thresholds that human beings cross throughout their lives: birth, puberty, death, and several others that correspond to moments of profound spiritual transformation, and that, when they are not recognized and honored with the seriousness they deserve, produce crises that modern psychology tries to treat as pathologies without understanding their spiritual dimension. The generation born between 1945 and 1965 is, at this moment in history, on the great threshold of the second half of life, or has already crossed it. This threshold, which C.G. Jung described how the second half of the journey is one in which the questions that have been postponed during the decades of life's construction, the question of what one genuinely is beyond social roles, the question of what remains after everything superficial is removed, the question of what to expect from a future that necessarily includes aging and death, these questions arrive with an urgency that can no longer be ignored. And the way the generation of 1945-1965 crosses that threshold, with conscience or without it, with spiritual courage or with frightened refusal, is one of the most visible and most formative contributions it makes to humanity's collective spiritual field. Steiner taught that threshold moments, especially moments when a human being is approaching the threshold of death, have a peculiar spiritual transparency. It is as if the veil that normally separates the physical world from the spiritual world becomes thinner in these moments, allowing the spiritual dimension of existence to be perceived with a clarity that phases of full immersion in everyday life rarely allow. The members of this generation who are aging consciously, who are not trying to ignore or postpone the aging process, but who are experiencing it as what Steiner would say it is, preparation for one of the greatest journeys a human being undertakes, these human beings are developing, precisely in this preparation, a form of wisdom that only conscious confrontation with one's own finitude can produce. And this wisdom, which is not melancholy or despair, but the serene lucidity of someone who is becoming progressively freer from the identifications that obscure the essential, is one of the most precious gifts that the generation of 1945 and 1965 can offer the world. Not through theories about death or comforting spirituality that promises everything will be fine, but through the quality of presence of someone who is no longer running away from their own mortality, who has learned to look at it without blinking, and who can therefore be present for other human beings who are facing their own mortality in a way that transforms the confrontation with death from a solitary terror into an accompanied crossing. The fourth dimension of mission, and probably the most difficult to articulate without sounding abstract, is what Steiner would call the custody of the sacred fire. In the ancient mystery traditions, there were always priests whose specific function was to keep the sacred fire burning, not a physical fire, although there was often a physical fire as a symbol, but the living flame of spiritual knowledge that was to be transmitted from generation to generation without going out. The moment when that fire goes out, when living tradition becomes mere historical memory, when knowledge that should be experience is reduced to doctrine, when what should be light becomes text about light, that moment is one of the greatest losses that spiritual history can record. Because what is lost cannot simply be reconstructed through the study of surviving texts. The generation born between 1945 and 1965 is the last that had contact, however fragmented and often unarticulated, with a world in which the spiritual fire still burned in ways that affected everyday life in real ways. Not necessarily a conscious, developed spiritual fire. In most cases, it was a more intuitive, more cultural fire than a deliberately spiritual one. But a real fire, the quality of presence with the sacred that religious traditions still manage to convey, even in their most institutionalized forms, the quality of silence that the days before permanent television still contained, the quality of community that religious festivals and rites of passage still created when they were lived with some degree of genuineness, this fire is going out. Not completely. Human beings have an ability to revive what seemed extinct that is itself a sign of their spiritual nature. But the specific way in which this fire burned in the world in which the 1945-1965 generation grew up is becoming increasingly rare, and the risk that it will go out completely before it has been adequately transmitted is real. And the mission of this generation includes, as one of its most urgent elements, the task of guarding that fire, of not letting what they still know vividly become mere nostalgic memory before they have found forms of transmission that subsequent generations can receive and use. How is fire transmitted? Not by describing the flames. That's just information about the fire, not the fire. Fire is transmitted through contact between flames. A live flame touches an unlit candle and lights it. Likewise, what this generation has to impart is not information about spirituality. There is an abundance of information in the world, and the abundance of information is not sparking anything. It is the quality of being that emerges from a life lived with some degree of spiritual awareness. It is the texture of a presence that has been shaped by decades of genuine search. It is the warmth of a heart that has learned, through loss, through discovery, through profound transformation, to perceive what is essential and not to get caught up in what is not. The direct encounter between two human beings, in which one brings this quality of being and the other is open to receive it, is the only real vehicle for transmitting fire. And that is why this generation's mission cannot be fulfilled through books or videos, although books and videos can create points of contact that open the door to real encounter. It needs real encounters, physical presence, conversations that last long enough for what is deeper to begin to emerge, relationships that develop over time and that create the space of trust in which genuine transmission can occur. This implies, for the members of this generation, a choice that is at the same time very simple and very demanding, the choice to be available for the meetings that the cosmos organizes. Not to withdraw from public spiritual life, from participation in communities, in search groups, in any form of coexistence in which the spiritual can be approached seriously, precisely at the moment when family and professional life is leaving space for this type of engagement. To use the freedom that aging often brings, the freedom of no longer needing to prove, of no longer needing to live up to the system's expectations, of finally having time for what matters, to do exactly what matters, being present with everything you need, which is for the souls that the cosmos brings your way. The relationship between this generation and the historical time that lies ahead is something that Steiner would approach with a mixture of seriousness and hope that is characteristic of his way of seeing things. He was not optimistic in the naive sense of believing that everything automatically goes for the good, but neither was he pessimistic in the sense of believing that the forces of evil have the last word. He was a realist in the deepest spiritual sense. He saw clearly both the forces that threaten the development of human consciousness and the forces that sustain it, and he believed, based on his direct perception of spiritual realities, that human freedom is real, that the choices that human beings make have real consequences, and that the cosmos needs human participation for its evolutionary project to be realized. The participation of this generation in the evolutionary project of the cosmos, the specific contribution it is being called upon to make in the years and decades it still has in incarnated life, is not less because it is often invisible. Steiner taught that the most important actions taking place in the world are rarely the most visible actions. Grand historical gestures are often possible only because countless smaller invisible actions created the conditions for them to occur. And the smaller invisible actions that the 1945-1965 generation can perform, the meeting that takes place on a Sunday afternoon in which an older person and a younger person actually talk, the story that is told before bed and that plants a seed that will only sprout decades later, the ritual that is kept alive in a small group and that preserves a quality of relationship with the sacred that would otherwise be lost, these actions are building something that future spiritual history can recognize as fundamental even if visible history do not register them from now on. You were born between 1945 and 1965. You carry within you the memory of a world that is disappearing and the ability to contribute to the construction of a world that does not yet exist in its complete form. You have been prepared by incarnations that you do not remember consciously, but whose marks are inscribed in your way of seeing, feeling, being, for a role that the cosmos needs you to play now, at this end of incarnation, at this stage of life in which conventional social roles are becoming less constrictive and the freedom to simply be what you most genuinely are is growing. The ultimate spiritual mission that Steiner revealed to this generation is not a dramatic mission that demands extraordinary feats. It is the most human and profound mission there is, to be fully who you are, with all the depth that decades of life have made possible, in service to the souls that the cosmos brings along the path. That's enough. That's all. And that's more than most human beings realize they can offer. Steiner had observed in several conferences on the rhythms of human evolution that souls who incarnate in moments of profound historical transition often experience throughout their lives a specific tension that he called the tension between the born and the called. What is born is the set of characteristics, tendencies, capabilities, and limitations that soul brings with it from its previous evolutionary history, the karma that arrived with it at birth. The calling is what the historical moment demands of her, the contribution that specific period needs her to make. When these two elements align well, life has a fluidity, a feeling that what you're doing is what you should be doing, a quality of fit between the soul and circumstances that produces what the Greeks called eudaimonia. When they do not align, when a soul's karma has equipped it for something and the historical moment demands something different, crises of meaning arise, the sensations of being in the wrong place, of having potentials that cannot find expression, of existing in perpetual tension with the world one inhabits. The generation born between 1945 and 1965 experienced this tension in a particularly intense way, and for reasons that spiritual science helps us understand. These souls arrived prepared for a new chapter, but they found a world that was still trying to finish the previous chapter. A world that had just emerged from a devastating war and that was trying to rebuild normalcy, that valued above all the stability and predictability that the collective trauma of conflict had made seemed the ultimate good. The social structures they encountered, the nuclear family, the linear career, defined gender roles, the religious and educational institutions that passed on the heritage of the past without questioning its foundations, these structures were necessary for the recovery process, but they were incompatible with what this generation's karma meant, what he had prepared her to do. Hence the intensity of the conflicts that marked the adolescence and youth of most of those born between 1945 and 1965. The conflicts with older generations, the questioning of established structures, the searches in directions that the previous world had not explored. The counterculture of the 60s and 70s was not just a sociological phenomenon. It was, from the perspective of spiritual science, the first collective expression of souls who had arrived with a calling that the world they found did not yet have the structures to receive. Not everything the counterculture produced was spiritually valuable. Steiner would be the first to point out the excesses and mistakes. But the force that drove the questioning of established structures, the desire for a more genuine spirituality, the search for forms of community based on values rather than convenience, that force was real, and it had an origin that goes beyond individual psychology or social dynamics. As the decades passed, most members of this generation found, in different ways, with very different trajectories, ways to integrate their calling with what they were born with, to find ways of life that honored both what karma had prepared them to be and the demands of the concrete world in which they had to exist. Some did this through the spiritual traditions they encountered, both Western and Eastern. Others did it through work, finding forms of professional expression that were both livelihood and vocation. Still others did it through relationships, building forms of family and community that tried to embody the values they felt were necessary. And many did so through a combination of all these roots, building lives that were necessarily imperfect, but that contained in some measure the attempt to be something more than simply well adapted to what the world expected. This process of integration, this work that lasted decades, that produced crises and discoveries, that was marked by advances and retreats, that often seemed directionless, but that retrospectively reveals a pattern, is itself one of the contributions of this generation to the collective spiritual field of humanity. Because what has been learned through this process, the wisdom of what works and what doesn't work, of what is genuinely spiritual and what is just spiritual fashion, of what development requires and what is just comfort masquerading as spirituality, that wisdom is not just personal. It is a collective heritage that belongs to all humanity, and that the generation of 1945-1965 is being called to pass on in ways that make it accessible to those who have not yet traveled the path that these decades of searching represented. The fifth dimension of mission that Steiner would identify for this generation, and perhaps the most spiritually significant of all, is that which has to do directly with what he called the conscious preparation for death. Not preparation in the sense of putting matters in order, making a will, organizing papers, although all of that is sensible and responsible. The preparation towards becoming progressively more aware of death is in its spiritual dimension, of actively working to transform the relationship with mortality from a source of anxiety into a kind of spiritual practice, of using the remaining years of incarnated life to accomplish what the period between incarnations cannot accomplish, the work of synthesis, of reconciliation, of conscious completeness that is only possible while one still has the consciousness of the fully functioning, incarnated self. Steiner described the process that human beings experience in the moments immediately following death as a panoramic view of the entire life, a complete review of everything that has been experienced, presented all at once to the consciousness that is leaving the body. This review is not judgment in the conventional religious sense. It is more like an artist reviewing his work when it is finished, seeing what he has accomplished and what has fallen short of what he had imagined. And what this review produces, what it awakens in the soul that is going through it, will significantly shape the next period that the human being spends in the spiritual world and the choices he or she will make for the next incarnation. The mission of this generation, therefore, includes the work of doing this review in life, of looking at one's own history with the honesty and depth that post-mortem review will make inevitable, but while it is still possible to act on what one discovers, to identify what remains pending, the reconciliations that still need to happen, the recognitions that still need to be said, the acts of love that were postponed because time always seemed enough, and to carry them out now while time is still running out. Available. To find completeness that is not perfection. No life is perfect, but that is the sense of having been faithful in some essential measure to what one was being called to be. This conscious preparation for death is not morbidity. It is one of the most vital ways of living that exist, because the human being who is aware that his or her embodied existence is limited in time experiences each moment with a presence and gratitude that the human being who acts as if he or she were going to live forever rarely manages to mobilize. Awareness of mortality does not diminish life. When worked on consciously, it intensifies it. It reveals what is essential and what can be let go. It creates the conditions for the remaining years to be lived with a quality of intention and presence that previous years, occupied with construction, with testing, with meeting expectations, often did not allow. The members of this generation who are walking this path, who are using the years of late maturity and approaching old age to do this conscious preparation work, are accomplishing something that has consequences that reach far beyond their own lives. They are demonstrating to those who observe them that it is possible to grow old with spiritual dignity, that the approach of death does not need to be experienced as defeat or as dissolution, that the process of letting go of the identifications that life has built can be experienced as liberation rather than as loss. This testimony, which does not need to be articulated in words to be communicated, which is transmitted simply through the quality of presence of those who are living the process with consciousness, is one of the most valuable gifts that any human being can make to the collective spiritual field of humanity. There is also one aspect of this generation's mission that Steiner would place in a special position, precisely because it is the aspect that contemporary culture most systematically denies and devalues, the aspect of spiritual legacy. The modern world understands legacy mainly in terms of material goods, what is left when one dies, distributed among heirs according to the will. Steiner understood legacy in a radically broader sense, everything that a life has accomplished that continues to have an effect after physical death, the transformations it has wrought in other souls, the seeds it has planted that will continue to sprout long after the planter is gone, the spiritual forces that have been developed and that karma will carry into the next incarnations like capital that enriches what begins next. In this broader sense of legacy, the generation born between 1945 and 1965 has, if they use the years they still have available with spiritual intention, the possibility of leaving a legacy that goes far beyond what any material measure could quantify. Each genuine encounter he creates, in which the full presence of a being matured by experience touches the soul of someone younger in a way that opens something that was closed, is an element of that legacy. Every story he tells, not just as entertainment, but as a vehicle for the living wisdom that only a lifetime of experience can generate, is an element of that legacy. Every community you help build or keep alive, every spiritual tradition you preserve and pass down with the understanding that it was earned through experience and not merely inherited, each of these acts is a contribution to the spiritual legacy this generation is uniquely positioned to create. And when, at a time that each member of this generation does not know when, but that the karma of each incarnation will determine with the precision that spiritual law always applies, the time comes to cross the threshold of death and begin the period between incarnations. What the human being will take with him will not be what he has accumulated materially. It will not be the recognition he received from the world. It will not even be the specific memories of life events. It will carry the quality of being that this life produced, the abilities that were genuinely developed, the wisdom that was genuinely acquired, the love that was genuinely practiced. And this spiritual capital, carried forward into the period between incarnations and then into the next incarnation, is the true legacy, not that which remains behind in the physical world, but that which advances with the eternal self that continues its development beyond the threshold that death represents. Rudolf Steiner revealed, not in a single, easily traceable statement, but through the set of his lectures, his meditations on history, his indications on spiritual development, a vision of the role of this generation that is at the same time more demanding and more hopeful than anything psychology or sociology could offer. More demanding, because it points to a responsibility that cannot be delegated, that belongs to each soul individually, and that time is up for grabs. Progressively becoming more urgent, more hopeful, because it asserts, with the authority of spiritual knowledge, based on direct perception rather than speculation, that these souls have been prepared for the responsibility they are being called to assume, that the karma they carry is precisely the karma that this particular mission, at this particular historical moment, demands. You were born between 1945 and 1965, and this is not simply information about when you entered the world. It is a description of where you are on a journey that began long before 1945, and that will continue long after 1965. It is an indication of a specific point in an evolutionary trajectory that the cosmos follows with the attention it gives to each of its parts. Because each part matters. Because each soul that fulfills its mission enriches the whole in ways that the whole could not enrich itself, because the cosmos needs what you are and what you can become even more fully. Your last spiritual mission in this incarnation is not in the past. It is in the present that is still being lived, and in the future that is still being built, one choice, one encounter, one act of presence at a time. Steiner developed, in his lectures on life between death and new birth, an understanding of the after-death period that reveals, indirectly but powerfully, what the ultimate spiritual mission of any soul in a particular incarnation actually is. He described how, in the first moments after physical death, the self and astral body experience a progressive expansion of consciousness, an opening that allows one to perceive, with a clarity that incarnated life rarely allows, connections and patterns that the limited perspective of the everyday self could not see. In this expansion, the soul perceives with increasing clarity what it has genuinely accomplished, what it has transformed into permanent spiritual substance, and what it has passed through life without leaving a real spiritual trace, however busy and active that period may seem to have been. And what becomes a permanent spiritual substance is not what has been accumulated materially. It is not what has been realized in the sense of the world. It is what was genuinely felt, genuinely thought, genuinely wanted, what emerged from the deepest self rather than simply being determined by environmental pressures. It's every moment in which attention was truly given, in which listening was genuine, in which love was real and not just conventional. It is every thought that touched something beyond the usual, that connected the visible with the invisible, that perceived in the ordinary the presence of the extraordinary. It is each act of will that emerged from the deepest self, rather than simply being the automatic response to what conditioning demanded. Understanding this, understanding that what the spiritual world registers is quality and not quantity, authenticity and not volume, the profound and not the spectacular, is what completely transforms the way we think about the last phase of incarnated life. The generation born between 1945 and 1965 is, for the most part, in this phase or approaching it. And what Steiner would reveal about the spiritual mission of this phase is not that it must multiply its activities or accumulate more spiritual experiences. It is that it must go deeper, delve deeper into what has already been begun, make more real what is still only partially experienced, be more completely what the best moments of life have already revealed to be possible. This deepening has a dimension that Steiner saw as especially important for souls in advanced stages of development, the dimension of forgiveness. Not forgiveness as a moral gesture granted to those who made mistakes, although that is also important, but forgiveness as the release of forces that have been trapped in resentments, in hurts, in disappointments that have not yet been completely processed. Steiner taught that the forces that get stuck in unresolved emotional patterns, the resentment that persists, the bitterness that still hurts, the disappointment that still defines relationships with certain people or certain periods of life, those forces are not available for spiritual development as long as they remain stuck in those patterns. Releasing them, through the inner work that genuine forgiveness requires, is not an act of benevolence toward those who have done wrong. It is an act of releasing one's own forces, of recovering the vital energy that was being consumed by maintaining the unresolved pattern. For the generation of 1945-1965, this work of forgiveness has dimensions that are at once personal and historical. Personal, because any life spanning several decades inevitably accumulates relationships that did not end as they could have, people who caused real harm and with whom reconciliation never occurred, decisions of one's own that produce regret. Historical, because this generation grew up in a context of collective trauma, the war that some experienced directly NTE, the nuclear threat that everyone experienced as a backdrop, the social injustices that marked the context in which consciousness was formed, and that left marks in the collective soul field that have not yet been completely processed. Genuine forgiveness of these layers, both personal and collective, is not a process that takes place in a moment or through an isolated decision. It is a progressive work that can occupy the entire last phase of a life, and each step taken towards it releases forces that are then available both for spiritual development and for service to others. The soul that reaches the threshold of death, having done this work of forgiveness, having genuinely let go of the weight of the hurts and resentments it has accumulated over decades, arrives with a lightness that transforms the process of death and the afterlife in ways that Steiner's spiritual science describes with a precision that most readers find both disconcerting and liberating. This generation's relationship with nature is another aspect of the mission that deserves to be named directly. Steiner taught, and all of his pedagogy and all of his spiritual science reflect this conviction, that nature is not simply the physical environment in which human beings exist. It is a living expression of the spiritual world, permeated by forces and beings that the developed consciousness can perceive and with which the developed consciousness can enter into relationship. The growing plant is not just a biological organism subject to the laws of genetics and chemistry. It is the expression of etheric forces that natural science ignores, but that spiritual science accurately describes. The animal is not just a survival mechanism driven by instincts. It is a being that carries a form of consciousness that is both more limited and in certain dimensions more intense than human consciousness. The generation that grew up before total urbanization, which still had direct contact with the land, with animals, with the rhythm of the seasons in a way that subsequent generations rarely experienced, carries in its bodily memory something that is spiritually valuable. The experience of having been a child in a world in which nature was a real presence and not just an object of visitation on weekends. This bodily memory, which goes beyond what everyday consciousness can articulate, but which manifests itself in how these people feel when they are in contact with living nature, is a spiritual resource that the development of consciousness can use in ways that go far beyond nostalgia. The mission of this generation in relation to nature includes both its own renewal of contact with the natural, the return, as far as possible, to forms of life that include regular contact with the earth, with plants, with the rhythm of the seasons, and the transmission to younger generations of the understanding that nature is not just a resource to be preserved for environmental reasons, but a dimension of reality with which human beings have a spiritual relationship that their spiritual health depends on cultivating. This transmission can occur in countless ways. The garden that you tend and that your grandchildren help care for, the walk in the forest that is at the same time physical exercise and lively contemplation, the attention to the changes of the seasons that is not just meteorological, but is an inner rhythm that the body and soul learn to follow. And finally, the mission of this generation includes something that Steiner would place above all else, because without it, everything else is incomplete. The development of love in its deepest sense. Not the sentimental love that is good when it feels good, that disappears when the other disappoints, that needs reciprocity to maintain itself. But the love that is an objective force, that operates regardless of how one feels at the moment, that persists beyond disappointments, that finds in each human being the thread of spiritual essence that connects him to the same logos that connects everything, and that can therefore be directed, even, and especially, to those who are most difficult to love. This love, which Steiner associated with the being of the Christ that is progressively awakening within human consciousness, is what transforms a human being from a receiver of spiritual forces into a transmitter of them. It is what makes each encounter a real spiritual event, each conversation a possibility for genuine transformation, each physical presence a contribution to the field of spiritual heat that the cosmos needs to carry out its evolutionary project. And that is what the generation born between 1945 and 1965, which went through the decades of development necessary for this love to become more real, more free, more independent of the preferences and fears of the little self, is in a position to offer the world in a way that no previous generation was so well positioned to offer at this particular historical moment.